Welcome to the Lightforge. This is ADWCTA.
This is Merps here with possibly, probably, most likely the last Lightforge before the big announcement.
Yeah, if you haven't heard, on the 11th, they're going. Blizzard has announced that on the 11th of March they are going to announce something, as Blizzard does. So the announcement of the announcement is already out, and assuming that the thing to be announced is not an announcement of the next announcement, then we should have some news and cards on the next expansion before the next Lightforge is out. So this is kind of the end of an era. It is the last time we are fully in the LoE meta in terms of what we're going to talk about. Because as soon as Blizzard starts releasing card information and things, will be more in a more speculative frame of mind, and less in a introspective, improve your game and analysis kind of frame of mind. So I think it's a very good time for us to cover the one of the topics that I've always wanted to talk about, but it's just not as exciting of a topic. It's a slow topic. It's about the priest, and it's about how to play the priest and the proper mindset that you should be in order to get the most out of the priest. And it's a very, very different. It's actually the polar opposite from what we were doing last week when we were talking about the hunter, and we were talking about smorking, and we were talking about going face and using your opponent's health as a resource in order to win the game before your opponent can use up their cards, in order to draft in a certain style, in order to make plays while looking for certain things. Well, as the priest, you're not really doing any of that. So you're actually watching out for a whole different. Your mentality has to be very different.
Yeah. And I think that I like how this is where we're ending, because I remember throughout all of the LoE talk, we were kind of like, at the very beginning, we were like, oh, I think this is the worst class. That's the worst class. We
Mm-hmm.
saw sort of the rise of Warrior, right? Not to like the very
Yes.
top, but we saw them rise to mid tier, which is more than any of us ever expected,
More than
right?
any other class has risen in an expansion.
Yeah, definitely. So with that, I think it's appropriate that we talk about the priest, because the priest is at a spot where some people might consider it the worst class. I
By
don't
some
know.
people, I think you mean you and me and pretty much
Yeah,
everyone else we've talked to.
it's pretty bad. And look, I think the bottom tier is composed of like hunter, shaman, and priest, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other classes are all a little bit higher. And depending on your play style, you might choose one of those just because. But yeah, I like how sort of the meta has settled, and at the end of the LoE era, we've come to the very bottom. The
Yeah,
priest.
we are at the very bottom now, and we all know the reason why the priest is at the very bottom, and it's not necessary. It's not an inevitable fate for the priest, but generally, the less control you have over a class, the worse it is when you're talking about when we rank classes. We always rank them based on their potential, but their consistency and their potential. And priest, because you have so little control over what is going on, is always going to be worse for an infinite player or for a really good player than for your average player. So it always gets hate from good players. I think fairly consistently, good players rank priest lower than average players, and that's because they just do worse with priests. Their skills are less applicable when you have less decisions to make.
Yeah, definitely. And we've always contrasted priests with their polar opposite, rogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
One has sort of powerful late game cards. If you look at the value cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like the Temple Enforcers and the Valen's Chosens, like you want something on the board first, versus the strong early game that the rogue has. And then it all comes down to like choices that you have, and this is what you're
Mm-hmm.
talking about. Like
Yep.
for priest, a good start is sort of like a one drop and then a two drop and then a three drop, right? Or like, maybe Vegas Chosen's in there, but that's sort of tough to do in the early game. With Rogue, there is no typical early game. Like you just, and if you have the coin, it's wide open. You can
Mm-hmm.
play a little bit slow, have a swing turn. It is totally within your control. So
Yep.
by turn four, a rogue might have had three times the amount of choices that
Mm-hmm.
a priest has, and
And
that's
if you're a
just
good player, you make those choices right, and you're fine. If you're a priest, you don't get to make those choices. So
Nope.
you get less of that margin. And your opponent is the one making those choices because they're the ones playing rogue or mage or whatever. And then you have to kind of depend on their skill level. So if they're making the right calls on rogue and you're making the right calls on priest and your decks are about the same strength, the rogue's going to win. That's just what's going to happen.
Right.
So what you want to do is put your opponent in the position of a priest or another, rogue, and you make like one decision out of the 30 in the first 4 turns better than your opponent, and that's your edge. So it's hard as a priest player to come to get to that edge. And you start having, it's even questionable whether you have more choices than other classes once you get like into the late game. Because on one hand, you do have, like, nominally, you have more things you can do once you get a board. You can always heal your minion, you can decide which way to attack, and all that stuff. But in reality, if that's your situation in the late game, you've already won. It doesn't take a high skill barrier. Like, your skill doesn't really matter, because the chances of your opponent beating you at that point is so small that the difference between very well played at that point and decently okayish play is very tiny. You're not going to get like an extra even 0.25 wins per run based on that skill differential.
Yep. So that's sort of, we've been comparing priests with other classes now. I think we should just dig into sort of the class itself and its
Yeah.
overall badness.
Okay. So the worst part about the priest, and I think this is so. Okay, let me pull the lens or the scope of what we're talking about really far back onto the game of Hearthstone itself, right? And I want to talk a lot about today, especially with this episode of Lightforge, about faith. And what I mean by faith is not like a belief in God necessarily, but a belief in Jesus, the random number generator that is the core of the game of Hearthstone. You don't know what cards you're going to get. You don't know what cards you're going to be able to select, and then you don't know what cards you're going to be able to draw. You don't know what your opponents are going to be able to draw. You don't know what your opponents are going to be able to do. You don't know anything. None of this is in your control. In this game, you have very little tiny slivers of control, and the rest is up to some other power. We can call it a higher power. We can call it the random number generator. It is the random number generator, but that's like a really long name. So I'm just going to call it the higher power. It is the higher power than the player, and it determines a lot of what goes on in every single Hearthstone game, regardless of what class you are. Unfortunately for the priest, I'm just saying the truth, and I think the truth needs to be said. We like Hearthstone as a game, not because we have no control over what is going on, but because the amount of control that we have is manageable, and we're able to exert our influence upon the Hearthstone world, even if it is mostly set up by RNG. And what's unfortunate for the priest is that more so than any other class, you are at the mercy of the higher power. You are at the mercy of the random number generator, the machine that controls this entire game, because you're always reactive. Right? I think it's an excellent decision on the part of Blizzard to make this class this way, because it really thematically fits with what the priest is about. You have to sit there, much more than any other class, and just kind of pray that things go right. You need your draws. You need your opponent to not hit their draws. You need to find a way to get on the board, but there's no real tricks for you to get on the board. So it's not really about how you're like thinking about it. It's more about whether it happens or not. Something outside of your control. Again, every time something's outside of your control, there's less of a skill differential there, right? Which is why better players hate on the priest more generally. But it does fit. And it is something that I think playing the priest lets you get better at playing other classes in. Because a lot of times in other classes, especially the rogue, and this is one of the reasons why I hate the rogue. I think it's a really powerful class, but I don't like playing it as much because there's too many decisions. It always feels like you're in control, even if RNG is going to go and screw you over at some point. The priest allows you to get into the mindset where it really relieves you of your anxiety playing this game, right? Because it's not up to you. Your wins and your losses are not in your hands. They are
Right.
in the hands of a higher power.
Okay. Well, thank you for that sermon. That is fantastic. I guess it is Sunday, so that was appropriate somehow. Um, Wow, typically I have a response for some of your comments, but and I'll be honest, I'm pretty much speechless. I
I
guess it's part of the higher power. I'm like blinded by all
I
of
think
this.
you can't deny the
I
works
can't
of the
deny.
higher power,
Mm,
and especially
no.
as you prepare. We're going to play priest after this. As you prepare to play the priest, you really have to give yourself over to the higher power and just accept your fate as it is dealt to you.
I guess I definitely accepted. Well, no, I fought against it, and that's maybe why I got one win with my last priest
See, you
run.
can't. Well, okay. The win again because you've given yourself to the higher power. Your wins are not determined by your faith. What your wins are determined by is just whatever the random number generator wants to spew out at you, for the most part.
Great.
So that's not a cause and reaction thing. That's just you being unlucky. But how you feel about it, right? You feel very bitter about your one win run as the priest right now, it seems. I'm detecting some bitterness.
Well, part of that is directed towards you, but yes, no, a lot of it is towards what you were talking about.
Yeah, and when you're playing the priest, you just really have to let all that go. Because you have to recognize, and it's actually easier to let go as a priest player, I think, because it's just more apparent to you that the game that you're playing is not in your hands, right? This is what I'm talking about with the rogue, where it takes a lot more thinking to figure out exactly where what I could have done what and it would have swung the game in which direction. And especially with the rogue, when a lot of these decisions are made turn one, turn two, turn three, and you don't really feel the difference until it comes out in like turn 12. So yeah, your turn two move where you didn't know whether to do one or the other may have caused you to lose the game, or maybe it wouldn't have mattered, but you can never figure it out. It takes way, way too much like brain power for you to figure it out, given your limitations as a human. But with the
Right.
priest, it's very clear. There are no decisions on turn one, turn two, turn three. All decisions that you're making until the very end are glaringly obvious. And so you know whether you win or lose. You know whether you made a misplay or not, for the most part. And so it's just much easier to accept that the outcome was not like if you make your good trades, you do, nothing stupid and all the like very basic stuff. You can just accept that the game is random.
So, i- when is the collection basket coming around? Because I'm
Well,
just
after Deep Fried Meta, right before Question from the Goat, we talk about our Patreon, which I think
perfect.
that's the collection basket if we're making that analogy.
There we
But
go.
I'm not being facetious here. I think this is a really good connection to be making with the priest, and this is why it helps your gameplay and all the other classes as well.
Okay, guys. In
It's
all honesty, even though ADWCTA is a hardcore role player right now, he does make a point in the like just parse out sort of the ADWCTA-ness of his statements, and he makes some really good points about the priest. Yeah,
and
but
not just about the priest, but about Hearthstone, about all of Hearthstone.
yes, about
Merps
all
is face
Hearthstone.
palming right now.
Give
Okay,
give
but
yourself up to RNGs.
but in all seriousness, there's very little I think we can talk about the priest technically speaking because there's just very little to talk about. If you go back and listen to our last episode with Shady Bunny about smorking and doing face damage and measuring and counting and whatever, there's a lot of things you can be doing, right? Even though smorking seems like, some kind of like brainless hit the face thing, there's a lot of math you have to do there. There's very little when you're playing the priest. You get
Yeah,
on the board, you try to stay on the board. You don't get on the board, you lose the game. It's
yeah.
that simple.
And the problem really with Priest is like if you just look at our tier list and look at all the power cards that Priest has, they are either cards that require you to have the board in order for max efficiency, like Temple Enforcer, or any
Mm-hmm.
efficiency at all, like Valen's Chosen, or like they don't really have any comeback mechanics. Holy Nova, if you don't have the board, that's just a much more expensive consecration.
Yep.
Excavated Evil, it gives you one more tool that you can have, and
But
it's
again,
really
it's one more mana than Hellfire.
yeah, exactly. It's one more mana than Hellfire, and also, people have learned to play around Excavate Evil now. It's not two is no longer the magical number. Now it's well, if I can keep something above 3 health, I will as well.
Wait, really? Is that how you're supposed to play against Priest now?
Well, if you're able to play it that way, right? If you're not able
Okay.
to play it that way, don't play it that way. But
Okay.
like if you can keep something above 3 health, then you keep it above it. And I've
Okay.
seen people play it that way, and it's definitely the correct way. Like instead of sort of getting something at 2 health, like if they have a 2-1 on the board, right, and they could just sacrifice that. You just sacrifice a 2-1, keep everything nice and healthy. Maybe you even play around MCT that way as well.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that the Priests, with their lack of early game choices, and all of their power cards, basically all of their power cards, requiring you to have the board in some state.
Yeah, well, like Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death aside, right?
Yeah, that aside, but that's a 1-for-1, right? Like
Yep.
you're not coming back by purely making 1-for-1s, and you could say Shadow Word Death also gives you some tempo,
I
and
think
that's
that's the
fine.
key
But
there. You're not coming back by purely going one for ones.
right,
As soon as your opponent gets one good trade on you, you don't have the small removals in order to get your tempo back on the board. Arcane, not Arcane Shot, Holy Smite being like literally the only counter example, and it's not like that great of a
no,
card. You don't have all the little pings. You don't have weapons, which is how like a warrior or like a shaman may get back on the board.
yeah,
Your board clears are highly predictable and take a whole ton of tempo, unlike say a shaman who can overload, or I mean warriors more for the weapons. What other? Oh, or a hunter, right, with like explosive shot or power shot or unleash the hounds. You don't have any of that. Everything is 1-to-1, and so you never get back on the board.
yeah, definitely. So yeah, I mean, weaknesses of the priest, and look, the priest has a lot of strengths as well, right? You grab the board, and in the late game, I don't think there is a more powerful late game, late game class if you have the board, right? You hit with the Temple Enforcer on your Stranglethorn Tiger, and you're pretty good from there.
Yep.
Like it's just really powerful, and LoE gave priests quite a few tools, but once again, they're late game tools. And we talked about this even before LoE came out. We were just like, look, they need another Shrinkmeister, right?
Yep.
Something like another early game power card. They
But
don't need
again, what
to
does Shrinkmeister require?
the board, right?
You to
But
have the
like
board.
they could use another 2-drop, right? They have Shadow Boxer. That's a rare though. They have Shrinkmeister. They have Cleric, but Cleric doesn't hold its own as a
Yeah.
yeah, like it gets dominated by 3/2s. They need just a solid, like they need a shielded mini bot, right? Like something that stabilized the paladins. Priests
Every
need
class
that.
needs a shielded mini bot.
That's fair, but like priests really could use that early game stability, right?
Yep.
Because
So
Shrinkmeister, without anything else, it's just a Raptor.
yeah, so that's what makes it. That's what will make it a better class. But what I'm more concerned about is priest is a hard class to balance because they've set it up like this. So once you give it the shield of minibot, it's going to be an overpowered class. It's going to be more brain dead than the paladin, and it's going to achieve even higher, like even better results as soon as you give it like some kind of consistent early game. So the only way forward for the priest, if you're Blizzard and you're trying to balance it for the arena, which I don't know if they go into that deep. Like, I don't think they're going to decide not to give it a shielded minibot because of arena when it's the worst class in the game right now,
Yeah.
arguably. But you have to worry about that. Like, if you give it 2 shielded minibots in the drafting odds, the game's over, right? Priest will be super OP. No one will ever be able to defeat a priest.
Shielded mini cleric and muster for prayer.
Oh, muster for prayer. Don't even say it. So yeah, so it's a balancing issue, and right now priest is definitely on the low end, but this is not a class like the warrior. You can't like it will get out of control if you balance it in the easy way to balance priest, which is to give it the steady like curve cards that you want, like the slightly overstated or slightly less removable early curve cards.
Yep.
So, okay, so that's Priest, and we're going to move on now to Deep Fried Meta, where we deep fry the meta, and this is a very, very connected concept to the Priest. It's, we say that we use this word a lot, it's called situational, like a card is situational, right? Especially when we're drafting, we're sometimes looking at our deck and we're like, but this card is too situational, I'm going to go with like a lower rank card or something like that. And situational is kind of like the word tempo. There's a lot of meaning packed into it, and it really takes a lot to like get to parse out all the different meanings of the word situational. So it's kind of a shorthand. It has a general meaning, and we use it to mean specific things in different circumstances. But how I want to tie this into the priest is that the reason situational cards, you don't want too many of them, and they're a little iffy, is because the situations in which they would be good don't always occur. The more situational a card is, the less frequently they occur, and the more it gets stuck in your hand, and the more you're unable to do anything with it, and the less ability to do things you have as the player, and the more your entire run is in the hands of the higher power, the random number generator. So as the priest, you're even more susceptible to this, and it's absolutely not a coincidence, right? Like we were saying, that
Yep.
the priest cards, they're all situational. Requiring the board is a situation. You will have the board like, what, half the time? Maybe a little more than half the time? Even without requiring the board, even something like Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death, it's got to have the right amount of attack. Like, what kind of a weird situational like trigger is that? It has to have only 3 attack or less, or 5 attack or more. If it is a huge card with 4 attack, you're out of luck. This is all things that a normal class would be able to control to a much larger extent than the priest, because all of the priest cards are situational.
Right. So I think we should start off by sort of defining situational, right? Like we tossed out this idea and we should define it. Like Adok, since this is your topic, I'm going to give you the first crack at it and I'll add on a little bit to it.
Okay. Okay.
All right.
So most people think of situationalness and they think of it as opposed to curve cards, which is pretty right. Like if you have a croc, it's not that situational. You play it, it's a 2/3 body, right? You're not like holding it like a coda, waiting for your opponent to play something. You're not holding it like a Frostwolf Warlord, waiting for yourself to get in a big board. It's not an Acolyte of Pain where you want to wait until it has a good chance of, hitting an opponent to deal 1 damage and pick up a card and then get hit again and pick up your second card. It's none of that. So you think it's not situational. But even a croc is situational. Imagine your opponent, let's use a raptor, it's even more situational than a croc. Imagine your opponent has a 2/5 on the board. Now you can play a croc, or you can, do nothing or do something else. The croc has become situational. The situation for the croc is my opponent can't have a 2/5 on the board. That's the situation, or it loses a lot of its power.
You mean a raptor.
Right, a raptor. On the other hand, if your opponent has a 6/3, an Ethereal Conjurer on the board, a raptor is great. So while Raptor is not very situational, it's still somewhat situational. And that should tell you that every card is at least somewhat situational. Your next level of situationalness is probably something like a removal. You always play after your opponent's turn, so your opponent probably will play some minions more often than not, and then you can remove something. So yes, your opponent has to do something, but the thing your opponent has to do is so freaking basic to the game that it's just going to happen more often than not.
Yeah.
And then you get to like the more complicated situation levels that we were talking about before with like Kodos. It's like actually written in the card, or it's like a double removal, so they need 2 cards, like a cleave, right? They need 2 targets, at least one of which has to be good, and there's a randomness factor, and a lot of things come out. And then you have your things that require you to have a board, which is situational because you only have the board X amount of times. So that's how I'm going to set up the situationalness of I guess. The Hearthstone world in general.
Sure. So I'm going to add upon that definition by saying, if any of you guys watch us when we draft and we say we can't take this, it's too situational, or something to that effect. What we also mean is by situationalness, you're looking at sort of the ceiling versus the floor, right? And you look at sort of like that range. And some cards have a very high ceiling and a very low floor. Some cards, though, have a very high floor and a very high ceiling.
So yeah, those are called really, really good cards.
Just really, really good cards, right? So, here's the thing: I don't want people to think that like if it requires a condition, it's a situational card.
That's a great point.
Yeah. So stuff like Unearthed Raptor, right? It has the stats that you want from a 3-drop. 3/4 for 3 mana. It is still situational in that you can, quote, lose value on it by dropping it on an empty board, but you still get all the stats, right? You get all of the stats, and it's just almost pure upside. You get to copy the Death Rattle of Piloted Shredder or Haunted Creeper. That's fantastic. That's just pure upside. But the floor is just the Spider Tank, and that's something you will gladly take because Spider Tank is a great card. And then you get to something like Enhanto Mechano, right? in which the ceiling is very high, but
The
floor is
flow.
very low. Because if you drop it on an empty board, you would never do that. But if you did, you're basically getting a 2-drop for 4 mana, right? And in the case of the Unearthed Raptor, you're still getting a premium 3-drop for 3 mana.
Mhm.
So situationalness, like, is the Raptor situational? Yes, in a way, but not in the way that we are talking about. You're not giving anything up for the benefit.
Right. So, I think it's fair to call the Raptors situational in a strict way. But when the floor is so high, we don't consider it situational because
Yeah.
you're always weighing a card against another card. So even in a vacuum, it's not like you're weighing a Raptor against another three, but you're weighing the Raptor against another three you may have in your deck or another three you may draft. And so in that case, what is a Raptor? Well, it's base level incredibly good, and then it's situational on top of that.
Yeah.
So yeah. Now the thing with situational cards, and the reason why you don't want to have too many situational cards is, like, obviously the situation may not occur, and each situational card you have in your hand isn't additive of the percent chance that your hand is stuck and you can't do anything good to it. It's exponential
Hmm.
because each situation, each card that is situational takes up a spot in your hand. They're not just like extra cards you have hanging on. They replace a card that you could have played before. So if you have a hand, like your starting hand of 4 cards, if you're player one, and 1 card is situational, you have 3 cards you can play that don't need situations, right? So you can plot it around. So you can, drop a 3/2 or a 2/3 or whatever based on what you need. Now, on the other hand, if you have 2 cards that are situational, well, now you've lost 1/3 of your options compared to if you just had 1 card. That's a big loss. So you always want to keep the odds of your hand being, like, even sort of filled with situational cards to a minimum. You may think, well, as long as I have 1 card that's playable, that's fine, right? The other cards can all be situational, but that's not the case because what is a war golem? Is it a situational card? No, it's a pretty blanket I can drop into anything kind of card, but you can't play it until turn 7. So for all intents and purposes, on turn 2, it's worse than a situational card. It's a dead card.
Yep.
And
Right. It's not a card that you can play. It's just the board state is bad for it. It is, unless you hack the game, you can't play this. Period. So
yep. So yeah, so you have to think of the danger of having too many situational cards in your deck in that way, which is why a lot of times people are looking and they're like, "What? You only have like 6, 7 situational cards? Like, you're fine." I'm like, "Well, it's the 15th pick." Right? Like, we're at 50% situational cards, and I don't want, like, at most more than 1/3 of my cards being situational. That's a general rule of thumb that I take, and it's if I'm trying to make sure that I establish a board, I want even more curve cards and less situational cards. If I'm playing kind of off the board a bit, like let's say I'm a rogue or I'm a control mage, then I can deal with a little more situational cards, a few more situational cards ratio wise.
right. And this is something that we wanted to introduce because we do talk about tempo a lot. We talk about card advantage. And during the draft, situationalness is something that we've mentioned a few times, but we haven't gone in depth. And it is something that, it's one of the millions of things you also want to consider as well. There are situational cards which are I don't think anything is an auto pick, but something like Shadow Madness, right? That is just a super good premium card,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to take it over a lot of other cards. And then you have sort of bad situational cards like Divine Spirit, right? But this is where sort of experience with deck composition and drafting is going to come into play. It's like you're at the
Mm-hmm.
12th pick, you're at the 28th pick. It's like, now do I pick that Enhancer Mechano? Like, do I have the deck for it? Now do I pick like the third Shadow Word Pain? Is it like situationalness in terms of just the card restriction, or is it situationalness in terms of I have too much removal now, right?
Right. Right.
So like all of these things kind of can restrict your gameplay and restrict your choices, like ADWCTA said. And if we're going back to talking about the priest, then suddenly restricting your choices when you didn't have that many choices to begin with is really, really bad.
Yep. So the priest just has a lot of problems, and they all compound on each other. So it's boom or bust for the priest. But I want to talk about one very specific kind of situationalness, and it may trip some people up. Arcane Intellect, or in the priest case, Thought Steal, is a situational card. It's a situational card, not because it has a different effect depending on when you play it, or because it takes a lot of mana to play. It's only 3 mana, and it has the same effect pretty much no matter when you play it. But it's situational because you are rarely in a situation where you can give up 3 mana worth of tempo and not be really far behind. So this is more like the War Golem, right? Only instead of not being able to play it at all, it's just really, really unwise to play. The situation in which you play this card is a turn in which you can squeeze it in, and that's hard to come by. So situationalness, like you can see, right? Like there's no good like single definition for it without that actually means a damn. Anything that we can come up with always takes the situation into account, and that itself being variable makes it really hard to define the term. But it's just some food for thought when you're kind of constructing your deck. A lot of decks that fail are because they're too situational. But if you don't have any situational cards, your deck will just suck.
Yep.
Because
Yeah, I mean, we're just past the point where you can win with like Croc into Vanilla
yeah.
3, into Yeti, into whatever. You need those combos, you need those X Factor cards in order to win now.
Yep. Okay, so that's it for deep fried meta and the situationalness of your deck. Let's move on to a question from the goat. Question from the goat is brought to you by the Grinning Goat, which is our I guess our organization that we do stuff from. And our Patreon, for those who want to feed the goat, is at patreon.com/grinninggoat. We have no sponsors, so the Grinning Goat is our sole, well, and like Twitch subs are our sole sources of income for this stuff. So please feed the goat if you want. And what is today's question from the goat?
All right. So I think I always love speculation, okay? It's something that I love to do. We're pretty gosh darn sure that the expansion is going to be announced next week. And with that, it's going to come leaks and hypes and everything. So I'm going to ask like a two-part question. What do you expect to see out of this expansion? And what do you hope to see out of this expansion?
Okay. So the first thing, and this is something Blizzard has done really well, I want to add. So it's not like a concern so much as I want to make sure they stay on this path, is that whatever new thing that they bring out needs to be simple. A mechanic, like the game is complicated enough for what Hearthstone is. Like, I don't want to see Hearthstone become Magic the Gathering. I don't want it to have a whole rule book and all these like stacks. I mean, there's stacks, but the stacks are hidden. I don't want like any complicated interactions with those as a base mechanic that you see all the time everywhere, right? Like you can have a card that has a complicated interaction. You can have, legendaries with complicated interactions, but overall the feel of the game, and this is what affects Arena so much, right? Like common cards and rare cards. I want that to stay simple. And Blizzard's done a great job of it, right? GVG was the first large expansion that came out. What did it add? Nothing. It added mechs. There was already tribal synergy. It basically added nothing. The second one, TGT, added jousting, which is nothing. It's awful as a mechanic, but it's still not complicated. And also Inspire, which, while it affected the game in a variety of different ways depending on your class and how you want to do things, it wasn't a complicated concept to play, right? It's fairly intuitive that you put the minion out, you use your hero power, and then you try to keep it alive so you use your hero power again. It's not that terribly complicated. So I want to make sure that it stays simple.
Okay. All right. So you've basically said what you want, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then I'll say what I want, and then we're going to answer what we think is going to happen. Okay. Now, what I want is much simpler and yet much more important, okay? We need another Happy Feast of Winterveil. We need more emotes, okay? Because this is the thing. You can add a feature and then replace it with something else, right? Or you can add a feature and, tweak it, revive it. you can't add a feature and then brutally take it away from us when
I
we've
agree.
tasted like the sweet nectar of Happy Feast of Wintervale.
I
All right.
agree. I completely agree. Blizzard gave us an emote, and now we have one less emote.
It,
Why is it a UI problem? Is it too complicated to make extra bubbles pop out of the guy for us
too
to
too
select?
confusing. Too confusing. But no,
I mean, maybe
look,
we just have to unlock them, right? Like, you need a certain amount of experience in order to unlock the emotes,
if they
so
make
that
us
it
play
won't confuse new
constructed for Happy
players.
Feast of Wintervale, I might have to play constructed for Happy Feast of Wintervale. Um,
Oh, if they lock emotes behind ranked play, I will play
mhm.
ranked.
Yeah, I know.
I
But let's not
mean,
give them too many ideas, all right?
no, I mean they shouldn't, because that's evil thing to do to arena players. But I would, I would capitulate. Is that the word?
I don't know. I don't stop with your words, man.
All right, all right. We've established we're not good at big words.
Anyways, that's what I want. And okay, and as for the expansion, look, all I want from Blizzard, I'm like, please consider rarity for Arena. Like, please consider it. There's no
Yes.
reason. Look, if you made Keeper of Oldemon into a rare,
Hmm.
would it have turned a lot of people away from the game? Like, is it that bad to force people to like, spend some dust on it? Or
No, but
I
they
don't
don't.
know.
That was even an adventure. Everyone just gets it.
Oh my gosh, yeah, you're right.
It,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
like rarity when it comes to the adventure actually has no meaning
It has
except
no
in the
meaning.
arena.
No. So it's purely
Yeah,
an
Blizzard
arena
thought that
consideration.
paladins, in the
Yeah.
TGT meta, paladins in the arena were not
Well,
powerful
it
enough.
only matters if like a year from now it gets phased out and people have to craft it, right?
Right, but then
Why?
it's wild. I don't think Blizzard is going to care too much about balancing
No, no,
wild.
they
And they
shouldn't care that
can't.
much. Right. Especially rarity for
Yeah,
wild. Like if you're playing wild, okay, go ahead. Like
go
should
wild.
go wild. Ooh. Yeah. No, but please keep rarities in
Yeah.
consideration. Seriously.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm very happy with LE from an arena perspective. I think it did amazing things for the arena.
Yeah.
But Keeper of Oldemon was one of those cards where you're like, all right, fine. You clearly wanted this to be what the arena is like now, and we just don't see why.
I felt like I still remember our LOE previews. Every single time I want to talk about that card.
Uh huh.
I,
And right, it changed the entire way you play against paladins, and paladins are still everywhere. So it's a very relevant thing to think about every single time you play.
yep. Anyways, so what do you think will happen?
Okay, so here's what I think will happen, and I'm also going to put in a little bit of what I want to happen. So I'm going to try to bend the rules here a little. Um, there has not been a lot compared to the amount of cards added. There hasn't been a lot of multi-minion removals being added to the game,
Hmm.
right? Like you have Excavated Evil, that's a rare. You have Power Shot, that's a rare. You have Elemental Destruction, that's an epic. Demon Wrath, rare. Dark Bargain, sorry, Dark Bargain is a epic, I think.
It's an epic card. Yes.
Yeah, it's an epic. Revenge is a rare. Like, they're not a Dark Iron Skulker is a rare. Like, Blizzard's try to sort of keep up with the amount of board clears that are available, but they haven't. It's fallen behind, and it got to a pretty bad point in TGT, where with the TGT bonus, there just wasn't enough board clears, and there wasn't any way to punish like being like spreading out on the board, and the game got a little stale in that direction where everyone that was the goal for every single class. And you brought it back a bit because the TGT bonus was gone. But in the next expansion, if they do what they did with TGT again, which is to introduce almost no common board clears, we're going to be back in that problem. But it's going to be even worse because now we're X number of cards even deeper into the pool. So something that absolutely needs to be thought about when they're doing this whole like releasing cards things is we need more board clears. We absolutely need more board clears, and they need to be common. And the secondary consideration, and this part of goes in line with you were talking about the Keeper of Oldemon, why that's such an awful common card for the Paladin, is that you need to keep the flavor of the classes, the soul of the classes needs to be kept intact. And you have Hunter, Shaman, Mage, Priest, and Warlock, which is what I call the magic classes. Okay, Hunter's not really magic, but it functions like magic, you know?
Base so magical.
No, I mean like they have the power shot, explosive shot, multi shot.
No,
Like
they really are. Yeah.
think about it in all games. What is a ranger type archer type character except a different way to play mage, right?
Yeah.
It's a range character. That's all that matters.
Yep.
They have the board clears and all that stuff too. Well,
Yep.
some archer classes in RPGs are built more like snipers,
Base magic.
but hunters, clearly have the whole like shebang with explosive shot, power shot, multi shot, unleash the hounds, all that stuff. So for those classes, you want to add more board clears. And for the other classes, warrior, druid, rogue, and paladin, you don't want to add more board clears. Or if they are board clears, they have to be either very small and not powerful, like whirlwind, like death's bite, cleave, swipe, starfall, fan of knives. Consecration is like pushing it, but that's like as high as it should go. All right, because they're warrior classes. Paladin's a little weird because they can do things like equality and whatever, but it's still not removal. Like you're still trying to make these classes be like warrior type classes, right? Where you go one on one. Rogue gets out of the situation in a very interesting way, which is that they have almost all of their cards deal 1 damage to something. So they have a million pricks at you, and that essentially gives them a weird way of doing multi-minion clears. You just spreads your damage out from multiple cards, and you have a hero power. Druid and Warrior a Warrior uses weapons, so the multi-minion damage comes in 2 turns and costs your face. Like, they're interesting ways to do multi-minion removal. Like, don't change that. Keep it interesting.
Gotcha. No, I think that's a good answer and very appropriate as well. So that's what you're expecting to see, right? Like some board clear, some of that stuff.
I'm definitely expecting to see board clears. I think Blizzard also probably wants to make board clears. They're fun. You can do weird things with it. I thought Dark Bargain was great creativity-wise, but they made it into a epic, which is also fine by my book. But they need to come up with more things, especially for Priest. And I'm gonna like hammer this in on Priest because in Constructed, Priests have the Circle of Healing combo with Auchenai Soul Priest. They have it. They will continue to have it because those are classic cards, and that is their primary mass removal. That's like so key to like playing a control priest in the arena. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to play a control priest the way you could play a control mage?
Yeah, it definitely would. Up until now, it is basically not possible.
It's not possible. Like Excavated Evil, step in the right direction, but we need another one, and it needs to be common. It needs to be like Holy Nova, but without the whole thing where you need the board. It just needs to be, look, we're controlling the situation.
Yeah.
It could even be something like Vanish, right? Like, who cares? But it just has to control the situation. Like, that is a definite need for Priest.
Yeah, I think so as well. All right, so what I think will happen is just by looking at the sort of cards that are being taken away from constructed play, right? You're taking away sort of quite a few cards like Zombie Child. You're taking away a lot of sort of fast cards, right? You're taking away
fast and sticky cards.
Fast, sticky cards, exactly. Haunted Creeper is out, Zombie Chow is out, and that's like the anti early game aggro, right? Like, so by taking away those, I think they almost have to introduce that because it's been such a staple now because they've developed the later expansions with Zombie Chow and Haunted Creeper in mind, right? By taking those away, suddenly, like, are you going to make a pure control meta now in sort of standard? Like, I don't think, even though some people might praise it, you're thinking about the overall health of the game, right? So because if you're thinking like that, look, we're not going to see Z Chow and Haunted Creeper just with like a different picture and a different name. I think that would be super lame.
Do you remember the Booty Bay? Do you remember the Magma Rage?
Right. Okay, so 0 mana Zombie Chow, is that what we're gonna see?
I'm just saying, don't be surprised if Zombie Chow comes right back with like, heal your opponent for 8 health, right?
And it now costs 0 mana. Perfect. Fantastic. Yeah. No. So they have to make some early game. And that's what I'm expecting to see. Sort of like innovative early game. Like, look, we might even see and look, I think this is still too big of a hurdle for them. We could see a 1 mana 2/2, right? Vanilla 1 mana 2/2.
You've been pushing that card since
I've been pushing that
Classic.
card since forever. I think, look, I think it's time for it. But yeah, like we could even see something like that. And that's what I'm expecting. Like a lot of the early game is going to be gone, and we're going to see some innovative, I hope, early game options that, while it might not make the game as fast as Zombie Chow and Hana Creeper, and like it has to be really powerful to make it fast or as fast or faster. But I'm interested in seeing that, and I think that they have to make other early game options.
That makes sense. Well, I guess we'll see what direction they're going before the next Lightforge. The one last thing that we will briefly talk about, and we already kind of talked about it, but with Card Good Bad today, we'll talk about Excavated Evil. This is a card that we just rose 14 points because in our last tier list update, it's not like we had a tier list update. We just updated this one card because I was playing with it like yesterday, and I saw it on the draft, and I was like, wait, there's no way this card should be that low. What are we doing? And it's just, so Excavated Evil is 5 mana, it deals 3 damage to all minions on the board, and then it goes into your opponent's deck. And this card, we rose it from it was like a 52 or 54 or something, and now it's a 66. It's like 2 points less than a Yeti. And just because we thought, like, if you're a priest, that's one of your few cards that can help you get on the board, right? Your opponent overextends or something, you play it, and now your opponent's running out of stuff, right? You can actually accept. One of the ways the priest can actually get on the board is your opponent keeps trading into your minions to prevent you from buffing your minion, which is kind of a good plan, but they don't deal face damage to you, and eventually they run out of cards. Yep. This guarantees that they will run out of cards far before you do, and you eventually just plop down 10 mana worth of minions, like 2-3 turns in a row, and they can't keep up, and you have the board.
Yeah, and the fact that you shuffle the card into their deck is great for you. If you are the one, like if you're using Excavated Evil, you probably don't care that they're grabbing it, right? You don't want them grabbing like their Piloted Shredder. You want them grabbing Excavated Evil because you're trying to get back into it. And if you get back as the priest, lots of times it's having like 1 or 2 big minions instead of flooding the board with little guys. So yeah, it's definitely a card that we ranked a little bit too low, and it was sort of not. It's a meta consideration, and also just it's a card that you have to use a couple of times, right?
Yeah.
And seeing like because if you just look at it on paper, like what's the biggest question you have for Excavated Evil? It's like, well, how often is it applicable, right? Like how often am I going to be able to use it, and not only use it to great effect? And it's a decent number of times as a priest, whether you have the board or not. So. Yeah.
And when you do something like that, you almost don't care how much it costs, right? Like you just want it done. Right? You don't care what mana you pay. So the fact that it's 1 more mana than Hellfire doesn't make that big of a difference. And like Hellfire is where it is on the tier list also because it deals 2 damage to the Warlock.
Yeah.
Like that's a lot. That's a lot of damage for the Warlock. The Priest, not only do you not deal that damage to yourself because the card is structured that way, but you also care less. And there's a far larger chance as the Priest compared to the Warlock where you're off the board. Because Warlock has all those 1-drops that you like swarm the board with, and you can always get 2 cards so you don't fall behind. With the Priest, sometimes you're just like sitting there like, alright, well, how do I get back into this?
Yep. So Excavated Evil, that was a card that we had rated a little bit too low for a while, but after gaining some experience, we're pretty comfortable with raising it. And yeah, it doesn't help our priest that much, but it's there. It's something.
It's something. The priest will take what it can get for now, and hopefully in the next expansion, the priest will get some goodies.
Shielded mini cleric, muster for prayer.
No. Okay, so whenever I say I hope the priest gets better in the next expansion, I'm lying. By the way, I'm like just totally lying, in case you were interpreting things that I was saying before in a different way, because I don't want to face these new super powerful priests. I'm much more worried about the priest being super powerful than I am worried about it being the worst class.
And also, in addition to those 2 cards, what Coghammer, Godhammer. There you go. Godhammer.
Oh God. Let's not even go there.
Common Godhammer.
Yeah, like I'm much more worried about that. So the priest also isn't like where the warrior was by a long shot. So it's not like it needs that much help. So I would be totally okay if this expansion comes out and Priest remains the worst class. I would not feel badly about that at all. Don't let it go too far down, right? Like if Blizzard's listening to this, don't let it become the next Warrior. But if you want to make a class be the worst class in the game for the arena, Priest is a great candidate because it has the lowest amount of skill requirement and it is the most giving yourself up to the random number generator class. And that class, if you're in game design, should be the lowest when it comes to the average. It should be because it is the least amount of skill. All right, so I think that's it for me for the Lightforge. Do you have anything else you want to add?
That's it. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you on the other side of the big announcement.
Bye.
See ya.